Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Pediatric Consult. I'm Dr. Paul Bunch, your host for today. I'm in the studio with Dr. Joe Reel and Dr. Rachel Herbst, faculty members at Cincinnati Children's. Today's discussion is a little bit different than our typical. Usually we are talking about a specialty, a community practice support tool, but today's topic is something that applies to every specialty and many different interactions that we have. The topic is motivational interviewing and how to use it effectively in patient care. So to begin, Dr. Herbst and Dr. Reel, I'd love for you guys to introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about your background, about your interests, and just let the audience get to know you.
So I'm Dr. Rachel Herbst. I'm a pediatric psychologist, and I work in primary care, and I love being in primary care both for the direct care, and I do a lot of resident medical education, and MI is a cornerstone of the work that I do. And I'm really passionate about culturally responsive care, trauma-informed care, and we'll have an opportunity today to talk about how motivational interviewing is a really concrete way to bring those principles into practice.
And I'm Joe Reel. I'm a general pediatrician at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, so I work in a pediatric primary care clinic like many of the listeners here. I also do medical education research, and it's focused on using technology, specifically virtual reality, to help train clinicians on communication practices, including motivational interviewing.
All right, that's wonderful. Thank you guys both for joining us. So motivational interviewing is, I think, a concept and a term that most of us as practitioners are familiar with. We know it's a useful tool, a way to get our patients to achieve the goals that they're looking for, but I don't think many of us have much experience with it or a true understanding of what motivational interviewing is. So could you guys take a few moments to just define motivational interviewing in your own terms, maybe give some of the core concepts of MI?
Absolutely. So the cornerstone of MI is really what they call a way of being, right? So a lot of times when people have talked about it within medicine, they're like, oh, this is great. We're going to pull MI out as a strategy to use in this circumstance or that circumstance. And the folks that have developed this, so Bill Miller and his partner, Rolinek, they said that this really should be integrated into who we are as practitioners, and that it's not just this separate skill set. And so as I talk a little bit more about what MI is, I think it makes sense of why, if you don't use it and integrate it into your practice, it can feel not super seamless. It can feel really clunky. It can feel less effective, which is all accurate because it's really meant to be a way that you are in your relationships with patients that you have. So the core cornerstones of that spirit of MI are a sense of partnership. And so really approaching the relationship with your patients as being, co-equals in this space, and that you have expertise in medicine or psychology or whatever your background is as a helping professional. And the family has expertise in their lived experience, and that you're coming to the table as true partners within that. Another core component of the spirit of MI is acceptance, knowing that we're all at different points of change in our life around a variety of different things. I'm sure that all of us here today could think about something that we want to do differently or better. I know that I wish I had better sleep for this, cold that I had last night, and better sleep in general. And being able to accept where we're at while also still having a goal toward where we want to go and how we want to improve whatever the topic is. And the way we get there is not by sharing lots of information that we have or a lot of education that we have, but it's by evoking from that patient, from that family, what are their own reasons for change? Why is this important to them? How does this line up with their values? How does this help them with some other sphere in their life that is really, really important to them? And then finally, having compassion and understanding that, there are lots of reasons why we potentially don't change or why there are barriers to change. And so those core components of how we are with families, we kind of can't put on and take off. They really should be incorporated into who we are. And then there are specific strategies of how we do this. So what does this look like in practice? And one key strategy that's, I think one that comes to mind for a lot of folks is asking a lot of open-ended questions. And so asking open-ended questions gives us an opportunity to invite that other person to say, the experience and the expertise that you have matters. I want to come to understand what's important to you, your lived experiences. And as we talk about things like vaccines, that means that we want to understand, what are your thoughts and beliefs about that? What are your goals in general for your child as it relates to their health? What do you see your role as a parent? So asking a lot of open-ended questions, giving a lot of affirmations. So, again, that compassion and that partnership means you assume the best from somebody else. I know that you want your child to be healthy. I know that, in engaging in health promoting behaviors is really important for you. So I know that, making sure your child has good nutrition is important to you. Affirming that, reflecting back, so it's really clear that you are listening to that family and not just listening to respond, but being able to share that and then being able to summarize and bring it all together. And so those are the core components of MI. And on the surface, they oftentimes sound somewhat similar to skills that folks might use at other points in time. But as we go through with some examples, we'll talk about how it's really the intentional use of these strategies that help us guide people toward changes that they want to make.
Okay. Yeah, I think like a lot of clinicians out there, in terms of my experience with motivational interviewing, it's been fairly minimal, I think, during our training. So much of what I've learned about motivational interviewing is actually from Dr. Herbst, as we've developed some of these virtual reality education curricula. And what I really love is sort of that spirit of MI, right? I think we often think, I asked an open-ended question, I'm using MI, but really it's that whole intentionality and curiosity. I think when you look at the evidence in terms of how pediatricians, how clinicians are often taught about MI, it's typically through a didactic presentation, maybe a workshop that lasts a few hours. And I think what they found is that those types of approaches to training change attitudes, but don't really impact behaviors or clinical practice, right? So you really need deliberate practice and feedback to develop MI skills in a way that really aligns with that spirit of MI, and that is sort of one of the goals that Dr. Herbst and I have tried to do with our virtual training in terms of supporting clinicians' communication practices.
And Dr. Reel, your virtual reality training, you've been working on this for a couple years. Can you guys talk a little bit about the use of MI in the primary care clinics, the use of training that you've done, the history and the evidence at Children's?
Yeah, absolutely. So by virtual reality, what we mean is a graphical environment where an individual interacts with virtual characters in a seemingly realistic way, right? So that can be delivered using a 3D mounted headset, that can be screen-based, but the key to it is that it feels real, right? It's an opportunity to practice. So we've been working in this space since 2015, and over that time, we've developed a number of different interventions that focus on practicing communication. And even though it's been a variety of content areas, we've done trainings related to flu vaccine counseling, HPV vaccine counseling, behavioral health, conflict management, firearm safety counseling. All of them include that spirit of MI. And so the way that we train clinicians in using MI is through a process called deliberate practice. So deliberate practice is a kind of personal approach to training that involves engaging in a task, for example, recommending the flu vaccine, getting immediate feedback regarding how that went, and then repeating the task but changing your behaviors based on that feedback, right? And so then over time, by doing that, you can sort of master some of these communication skills that might be relevant to these topics, such as specific motivational interviewing practices. And that's the same way I think we learn CPR, right, is through that deliberate practice approach. So part of our research program is thinking about how do we use that educational strategy to train clinicians in MI.
Okay. And in the broader evidence about MI, are there any areas that have been really well studied or have been shown to be useful topics to use MI for?
Absolutely. So MI started actually with substance use treatment. And I like to bring that up because I think that feels like a really hard topic, and it feels oftentimes like something where people think, oh my gosh, how could I ever help guide somebody toward change if they're engaged in substance use? And it's been found to be incredibly effective. And so it's really taken off and grown out into this transdiagnostic approach for a lot of different concerns. So its effectiveness is well established in healthy habits, healthy weight management. It's well established in a variety of different like mental health settings. It's well established with adherence. It's well established with helping engage people in positive parenting practices. You look really broadly across the board, and oftentimes it's kind of the glue that makes everything else work is how I think about MI, right? Because we have, the problems that are in front of us. We have the specific recommendations that we would want to make and want to see a family or see a patient implement. And the MI is the how do we get from the point where we've identified this problem to the actionable changes that somebody can not only start to implement, but they can actually sustain that implementation of. And that's the case for, as Dr. Reel is talking about all of these topics require not just that somebody has a one-time commitment, but that it's an ongoing commitment, and MI is really the vehicle to help us partner with families to get there.
And it's clearly not just something to be used in a medical setting. You use the term helping professionals. I really like that. What other fields have you found have used MI?
So MI has been found to be effective with anybody that is actually in a helping profession. So they've looked at this, and it's not related to the level of education. And like, if you're really excited by this, they just published the 4th edition of the Motivational Interviewing Handbook that we'll reference in the show notes. But it's been really clear, which is, I think, exciting. Like, I've trained home visitation folks in how to use MI, and it's been used across a variety of different settings where if your goal is to help somebody make some change in their life, you can be trained to use MI effectively.
Okay. So there are lots of ways we can potentially use MI in our practice. The one that I think most pediatricians are going to think about frequently is vaccines and vaccine hesitancy. So before we get into how to use MI to help our patients, can you guys talk a little bit about vaccine hesitancy as a challenge in our profession, and how it's developed over the years, factors that have come into play?
Sure, absolutely. So by vaccine hesitancy, that terminology is defined as the reluctance or declining vaccines despite having vaccine availability, right? So when we think about the history of vaccines, it's really kind of intriguing, right? So, if you look at the public health interventions that have had the greatest impact worldwide, have saved the most lives, after clean water, it's vaccines, right? So the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention looked at the greatest scientific discoveries that occurred between 1900 and 1999, and vaccines was at the very top. But then, move forward to 2019, and the World Health Organization declares vaccine hesitancy a top 10 threat to global health, right? So why is this occurring? So I think it's multifactorial. So when we think about when vaccines first became publicly available in the 1940s, we think about that generation as being during the golden age of radio, right? When, what you heard on the radio, you sort of believed because you didn't necessarily have instant access to other information. And so over time, information access has become omnipresent, right? So I think with that, there's been skepticism or a decreased sort of belief in expertise because you can look up anything at any time. And that's great in some ways because it gives patients and families great access to health information, but also it means that it's a way for myths or conspiracy theories to sort of find ground as well. So I think it's really multifactorial in terms about when we think about why vaccine hesitancy has become so commonplace. And certainly there's sort of like mixed evidence around how much of a problem it is, right? So some studies would indicate that vaccine hesitancy is stable. However, there is high variability when it comes to geography, socio-demographic factors, and even certain provider practices. So if you look at even the 2020-2021 flu season, the rates of flu vaccine acceptance in Massachusetts were 84%. They're in the mid 80s, but in Mississippi they're 40%, right? So there's great variability. And then I think when we look across socio-demographic groups, that same season, the 2020-2021 flu season, individuals, Asian children had the highest rates of acceptance, which was above 60%. And then the lowest rates were among Black children, which was around 48%. So there's still challenges, I think, with equity when it comes to thinking about vaccines. But I think the big picture is that this is a topic that we need to think about, right? And we need to think about how do we partner with families to understand what the sources of hesitancy are and how do we address them. You know, I think families are seeing us in clinic because they want to keep their child as healthy as possible, right? And so we want to partner with them to help them understand why vaccines are an important part of that, by helping them navigate kind of all that misinformation that's out there, which has contributed to the seemingly increased rates of vaccine hesitancy that we're experiencing in clinical practice.
And maybe you'll say this as part of MI, but I've definitely found in my practice that recognizing that the parents are doing the best that they can for their kids. They're bringing their kids to us because they want them to be healthy. And then trying to meet them where they're at is where we have our most success. Now, they may have different ideas of what healthy looks like, but
Right.
at least trying to understand and recognize what their motivation is has definitely been helpful.
Right. I think when you look at the reasons for vaccine hesitancy across racial ethnic subgroups, safety is the number one concern, right? So patients, families, parents, they want to know that if they're giving their child something, that it's something that's safe, that it's going to be beneficial, that it's not going to have short-term, long-term effects on their health. And so I think when you frame it in that way, you know, you can really think about addressing vaccine hesitancy as an opportunity to engage and educate, as opposed to, you know, a nuisance that we are encountering in medical practice.
The other two things I would say is, like, just to really name the elephant in the room when it comes to race, is there's a very good and valid reason why there's vaccine hesitancy in Black and brown communities. I mean, when you look at Tuskegee and other things, those things are still alive and well in, you know, the discussions around vaccines. And this is, you know, the clinics that Dr. Reel and I work in, the vast majority of families identify as Black or African American. And so these are parts of the conversation where medicine has done horrible things to people using vaccines. And many of the people that were part of Tuskegee and subsequent studies are still alive, or their grandchildren are, you know, still having these conversations. And that fear and that mistrust is strong and valid. And as a healthcare, you know, system broadly, not just Cincinnati Children's, but really throughout the U.S., we've done a really poor job of naming and acknowledging why that is a really valid fear about safety, right? And then it creates the perfect breeding ground for other concerns about safety that aren't founded, because people don't acknowledge and they don't take ownership of the fact that that's there. And so I think although there is a piece of education that's actually a smaller component of MI, I think oftentimes that is the pull, right? Like, if I can just share with you the things that we're talking about and the way that we're talking about it right now, that's going to change your mind and it's going to lead you to change, right? But if we're thinking about these specific examples, especially within these patient populations where there have been horrible injustices that have been experienced, MI provides an opportunity, and these will be the conversations I'll oftentimes have with families about vaccines, is to say, you know, I'm hearing that you're worried about the safety. That makes sense to me, because in the past, there have been horrible things that have happened via vaccines where people were not honest about, you know, the risks involved, and there were significant safety events that happened because of those vaccines. And I wonder if that might be something you're thinking about when you think about the safety of especially new vaccines that come out, where we see higher levels of hesitancy. I mean, we saw that with COVID vaccines as well. And so to be able to name it, and that's like a deeper reflection, and we're affirming that we're both sharing this value around safety that's here. But the goal is to not just jump into the education about like how COVID was developed and why it's so safe. And that, it's not that we shortchange the safety processes to get to this point of having this vaccine, but to be able to name some of those things and create this space where then people can talk about, that oftentimes there's a conflict between what their values are and what their concerns are. And motivational interviewing helps us have this space where we can kind of, sort through those things together and figure out the balance for people so that they can feel as if they are trusting, and the relationship we have, to go back to that spirit of MI, is what enables somebody to trust and to hope that it could be different.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think before you can educate, right, and really understand the sources of hesitancy, you definitely need to recognize, validate, destigmatize the reasons or the things that the families, bring to that visit because they're legitimate, right? And so I think that approach of using MI, that spirit of MI, that sense of curiosity and understanding really can help open that door. And I think we used to think that, these discussions around vaccination were a one-time event, right? You use a presumptive announcement, you presume agreement when you present the vaccine, you provide a strong recommendation, and you should have same-day vaccination. Certainly, I think that is still the case for many families. However, I think for others, it's more building trust over time. And so, adjusting our framework to think about that and thinking about that as still success when it comes to protecting children and public health is something else that I think about.
So, Dr. Reel, using that presumptive statement model, that's certainly most of the time the way that I approach that in the office. But that's usually where you're going to hit that wall with the families who are going to be vaccine hesitant. Now, a few years ago, the AAP put out an article putting vaccine hesitancy on a spectrum, where you have the people who fully are vaccine champions, those who will go along with it, but aren't fully the strongest champions. Then you have vaccine hesitant, and then the outright vaccine refusers. And if I remember correctly, that article is basically saying the outright refusers, the hard nose, there's not a lot of value in putting your time into them. It's really that vaccine questioning group. Has that been your guys' experience with your research, that there is that spectrum and that there are certain points on that spectrum where it's better to put your energy into and other parts where you just have to move on?
Yes, certainly I think there is a spectrum when it comes to vaccine hesitancy, and often they kind of describe it as like a triangle, right? Where, the largest part of that triangle at the bottom is where most of our families are, right? And are accepting of vaccines. And that's why some of those communication behaviors that have been shown to be effective are so important, right? So the presumptive announcement is when you present the vaccine to a family, it's in such a way that you're presuming that they're accepting, right? So looks like Alex is due for the flu shot today, so we can go ahead and do that before you go, right? There's good evidence that that's going to work for a lot of families, right? But certainly there's that middle part of the triangle where there are families that are more nervous, where they might say, we'll pass on the flu shot for today. So at that point, I think is really when you can pivot and lean into those motivational interviewing skills. Tell me more. Tell me, what makes you nervous about getting Alex the flu shot? And then you can kind of learn more about the sources of hesitancy, ask to provide information, and if the family's open to it, provide that education, right? So I think certainly there are individuals who are more closer to the top, right? Maybe families, thinking about the child's never had any vaccines. I think it's still helpful to go into the conversation. The presumptive announcement, I think, can help to normalize it. So you still might use it, especially with standard childhood vaccinations. Like, oh, I see that, Alex, hasn't had her 6-month shots yet, so we can do those before they go. The family might say, we don't do shots. Okay, do you want to talk more about that? Could you tell me a little bit more? And they might say, we're just not interested. And I think being respectful of that, I appreciate you bringing Alex here today to make sure that she's developing and growing well. We recommend vaccines because we know that they can, help keep kids healthy. So if you ever want to talk more, you just let us know. I can get you information. And so I think that's sort of how I approach those different parts of the triangle.
I would tweak what you said at the end a little bit more. So
Yes,
if we have
please.
a family that, and we definitely have had many cases of this in clinic where they've refused, everything. They've refused like vitamin K in the nursery, like everything, and And so the way that I think about approaching that is you're less likely in that, like your goal, MI is not meant to be like a sneaky approach, which sometimes people will talk about, right? Like, this is the like psychological manipulation to get somebody to do something that we want them to do that they don't want to do. But thinking about, again, that the goal is to form a relationship. And lots of things can happen when you've got a relationship. And the great thing about primary care is it's the perfect place to create a relationship because you're going to see each other for years and years and years and years, right? And so, I think about that conversation less as like an opportunity to offer information or education or to even let that family know that that's always available, and more to say, I would still do the presumptive announcement of like, this is what's due today. What are your thoughts? Like if we've got it documented, right? What are your thoughts about that? Oh, well, we never do this. We never, we don't believe in any of this. Nothing at all. Oh, I can tell it's so important to you that Alex is healthy. And I'm so glad that we're partners in this. To be able to explicitly say that we're partners in this work. I realized vaccines are part of my values, and I want to understand your values more. And clearly we have this shared value around being healthy, but tell me more about like why you make that decision. And, as Alex's parents, you're in control, right? We want to emphasize that autonomy that people have, right? We've had families where, I think there's been concerns. Are they going to be judged? Are they going to be treated differently because they choose not to vaccinate? That's going to degrade your partnership. It's going to degrade your trust, and it's going to decrease the likelihood that you're going to be able to have as effective an approach with them for other topics that you're counseling on and that you're partnering on, right? Because if it feels like you show up and you're always, you've got some sense of being stigmatized because you've chosen not to vaccinate, that's going to affect the rest of the care that is provided to that child because the relationship is not going to be as strong as it could be. And so I think about that as that opportunity to really clearly say we share this value of, making Alex healthy. We have different ideas about what that might look like. You know what my ideas are. I want to understand what your ideas are. And then emphasizing that autonomy. I'm not going to try and sneak it in. Families worry about that too, right? So I respect you. You're going to tell me what's important. I trust that you're making decisions that are in the best interest of your child. And I think that's even more important for many of the families with whom Dr. Reel and I work with, where because of different structural and systemic racism, there are concerns that if they don't do things that the doctors recommend, that we might report them to JFS or that there might be other consequences that happen to them. And so again, what we'll see is sometimes we'll see families that just stop showing up for their child visits because they're not vaccinating and they're worried about all of these things or the stigma that we've talked about. Well, now we have huge care gaps that are secondary to vaccines and the way that we approached it. And so I think about for that kind of top of the pyramid, that's still the value in using MI. It might not change their opinion about vaccinations, but it still builds this foundation for all of these other health promoting behaviors that we want to be able to partner with families around in the primary care setting.
And I think the hard part is when we're doing this to ask that question, tell me more about your concerns, and then to stop there.
Yes.
Because we are so well educated, well trained, we just want a data dump and just give them all the information. Well, those are your concerns. Well, I can tell you this, 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 and this, why you're wrong. Or why, this is what the data shows. This is the risk. This is what measles really looks like. This is what, severe flu that I've seen. I mean, is there any data research or experience that you guys have of how effective that kind of just information overload or information sharing, depending on how much you do?
Oh, yes. There's so much in motivational interviewing that, really they talk about stop, drop, and roll. The moment that you find that you are trying to convince somebody, you're no longer doing MI. And I like to think about it as we have all been teenagers. Some people have teenagers themselves. If you have ever tried to convince a teenager of something, think about how they react, right? You see it in their body language, that their, arms are crossed, their head is down, they're on their phone, all of these other things. And now you've made it less likely that they are ever going to do whatever that thing was, versus if you just sort of lightly said, it might be really nice if, your homework was done now instead of later so that you can go off and do this other thing versus let me tell you all the reasons why you should do this right now. No, it's this tug of war, and that is when you've lost. And so if you do find yourself there, which we all find ourselves there, then the MI way to manage that is to own it, which we don't do a good job of. But that helps with that partnership to say, oh, I realize that you told me you aren't interested in learning more about this today. And because it's so important to me, I just kept sharing. And I realized that wasn't really respectful of what you told me. And so I'm sorry. I'm going to stop here. I didn't really mean to go off in this direction. And so just own it. Because I think that's the other thing is that there can be some sense as people are starting to use MI more, there can be some sense of shame that we're not being MI adherent in that moment, or, I'm the provider. How do I navigate this? And for so many families, that modeling of the humility and the acceptance is huge for the relationship because most of us don't have that happen in other relationships, but it's actually a core feature of healthy relationships is that you own when you've done something that you didn't really intend to do. So yes, great evidence that we should stop, drop, and roll and remember the inner teenager in all of us of what it's like when somebody tries to convince and nudge you to do something that you really are not ready to do.
And you guys have done a lot of training with the residency program on how to effectively do this, how to break those habits that, coming out of medical school, we are just full of information. So what techniques have you guys used with the residents to really teach them MI and effective methods and how to follow that path based on what the patient and the family is leading them to?
Yeah, so in our virtual reality type interventions, residents have an opportunity to kind of deliberately practice these skills, right, with virtual characters and then get feedback from a facilitator. And we focus on the spirit of MI, but we also focus on specific motivational interviewing strategies. So, for instance, in families, when you're encountering a parent who's not interested in getting a vaccine, we talk about asking an open-ended question, right? Tell me more, starting with that, right, to understand that source of hesitancy. If the family indicates a source of hesitancy, I don't want Alex to get sick tomorrow. I don't want her to miss school. So, I'm just going to pass on the flu shot. We teach them to reflect. So it sounds to me like, you want to keep Alex as healthy as possible, but you want to make sure that if you're giving her something that it's safe, it's not going to have bad side effects. Is that right? The family might say, yeah, that's right. So another motivational nurse interviewing skill we teach them is to ask permission, right? That's, I think, one of the critical elements, and something I certainly did not do enough before working with Dr. Herbst on this is asking permission, right? Is it okay with you if I share some of the most common side effects that we see from the flu shot, right? That gives you that opportunity to give the family that autonomy in terms of the amount and type of information that they're receiving. So after the resident would practice then in the virtual setting, addressing that specific source of hesitancy, the family may or may not be agreeable to the vaccination in the simulation. And so maybe a final skill they would use would be that affirmative language, right? So, I really appreciate how dedicated you are to keeping Alex healthy. So I'm really glad that we can protect her from the flu today. So that's kind of how it looks. And we usually use multiple cases and it's scaffolded. So it starts kind of basic, just bringing up the question, right? Using the presumptive announcement with discussing the flu vaccine, providing a recommendation. And then once the learner has demonstrated those skills, they can move to more complex cases that might involve various sources of hesitancy. The other skill we teach them is whenever I'm in a situation where I feel like I'm debating back and forth with a family, like Dr. Herbst had mentioned, sort of that stop, drop, and roll, I think about sort of reflecting and redirecting, right? It is time to move on, right? So, I'm really glad. It sounds like you want to make sure if you're giving Alex something that it's something safe. You could ask Marisha, could I tell you about some of the most common side effects that we see without having this back and forth about specific concerns the family might have been aware of. So that's the way we train. And the key to the training that we provide residents is the feedback. So you practice, you get feedback, you practice again, right? And doing that in that virtual setting, it's safe, it's realistic. It allows you to develop those skills, to learn the words that feel right for you when you're providing counseling on specific topics, and then implementing in practice, right? And the hope is that those behaviors will be positively reinforced in practice when you're building better relationships with families.
And we've talked about a couple different pitfalls or directions we shouldn't go with our with our MI. Are there any other common pitfalls or even red flags that you see either with residents in training or even with attending providers or community providers?
I think it's really easy for people to get in the habit of just asking questions. It's the most concrete of the skills that feels the most familiar, and then it means you could ask lots of questions and have no sense of direction and have no movement toward change. And so I think like being aware that there should always be, in MI, that your role is the guide. You're guiding somebody toward a shared agenda. And that agenda really truly has to be shared. And so the questions are in service of getting you more information that's going to help you identify what the strengths are, what the barriers are, some considerations about the implementation of it, but that it's all around this focus area. I think that's one common area. And then the second piece is that if you're doing MI well, we mentioned it briefly in the spirit, but that you're evoking. And so a very easy, quick check for folks to say, am I falling in that realm of the spirit of MI, is to say, who did more talking in the room? If I did more talking, I am not doing MI well because I'm not evoking and hearing from the family, right? And so I find that people are like excited oftentimes to like rapid fire use these skills that they've just learned, which is wonderful, and it's normal in, the development of learning anything new. And it means that you can kind of like lose the spirit of MI because you're so focused on the questions that you're asking or using this asking permission, which are great skills. But if you've lost the spirit, and that cornerstone of the spirit of like, I want to be a partner with you, I want you to talk more than me because I'm evoking things from you, I'm going to accept where you're at, right? And that I have compassion for where you're at. If you've lost that, you're not doing MI. You're just doing kind of a hodgepodge of skills. And so I find that that's what's most common, is that people are really focused on like the concrete strategies, and they've lost that way of being that is actually more important and from the research far more effective. And so the research has found that the more that that patient or that family talks about their own reasons for change, even if they're misguided, that is what makes them more likely to change. And so I think about this all the time with teens. I've had some teens where we've talked about, decreasing the amount of marijuana that they're smoking. And I had one teen, and I always think of him, where he's like, well, it can impact my like sexual performance if I'm smoking a lot more weed. And he had all of these ideas that were inaccurate about what would happen to him if he smoked more weed. And I was like, it's not important that I educate you that that's incorrect. Our shared goal is to have you smoke less marijuana. And so if your motivation is related to your sexual performance, and we'll talk about healthy sexual behavior somewhere else, but like if that's what your motivation is, I want you to talk more about that than me coming in and saying, what about your brain development? What about, like all of these other things? And so just remembering that that's an easy, quick way to check, is to check, did I have the spirit, and did I do less talking than the family for this specific thing? And then the very final thing is that in primary care, and we haven't talked so much about this, but we know that there's great literature that the length of time that's devoted to a well-child visit is not sufficient time to cover all of the bright futures topics or all of the anticipatory guidance that we'd want to give. And so the other pitfall I can find occurring oftentimes for both residents as well as those folks in practice is the excitement to want to use MI for everything, which is wonderful. And the reality is it doesn't fit within the time constraints to use it for everything. So I think about that as a continuum. If it's an emergency or if you really need to be directive about something, don't use MI. Don't give the illusion that there's shared partnership if you really need to make, an actionable decision because you're worried about the breathing of this infant, right? Like, you just need to take over and be the assertive provider in that moment, in that emergency or that urgent situation. And then there's general anticipatory guidance where you're talking about, the amount of physical activity a day or something else. And if that's not your target for change, just still engage in your regular anticipatory guidance. MI fits best when you have one single topic that you're focusing on. And so I think about this oftentimes as we ask families what their presenting concerns are during well-child visits. That's the perfect place to use MI, and maybe one additional topic area that we had identified, but trying to use it across the board. It gets messy. You have to be very skilled to do that. And frankly, there's not the time allowance to be able to do that. So being really intentional about the use of it. The spirit can be there regardless, but actually thinking about using MI should be something where it's a shared agenda item, or maybe 2 items at most, because otherwise you're going to do bits and pieces, and that potentially is going to have diminished returns because you're going to give the illusion that there's more partnership and shared decision making than what you really have time to do. And that will degrade trust if families feel like, you said that we were going to be partners in this, and now actually, because we ran out of time, that you just then shortchanged and gave these strategies in the end without them really being a partner in making that shared decision.
So you guys have given a wonderful overview of MI. For providers in the community who want to learn more, are there any resources either from Cincinnati Children's or anywhere else that you guys would point us towards to learn more and improve our skills?
Sure. So if you're interested in some of the virtual reality training that we've described, many of those are now courses through our Center for Simulation Research at Cincinnati Children's. So you can certainly contact the Simulation Center, or you can contact one of us, and we can get that set up.
The other 2 things that are low-hanging fruit would be the AAP has a Change Talk app. It's very basic, but for people that just want to kind of get the overview, and there's an opportunity to practice where you're selecting some MI language in a patient encounter. So it's not at the level of VR. I think of it as being more foundational than that. That is free, openly available, which is incredibly helpful. And then there is the 4th edition of the Miller and Rolnick book that we'll have linked as well. And there's actually a huge MI training network. And so if there was somebody that was really excited to become almost like a super user of MI, the book and then also some of the resources that are in the book would help guide people on next steps.
Yeah, there's another app from the AAP called the HPV vaccine, same way, same day. So that is publicly available as well. It's similar to Change Talk. The content area is focused on nutrition management, but the HPV vaccine app is focused on using motivational interviewing in the context of recommending the HPV vaccine.
Well, Dr. Reel, Dr. Herbst, thank you so much for your time today. I think we've learned a lot. For our listeners, just a reminder that today's episode is available for CME. You can find a link for that in the show notes, as well as some links to some of the resources that Dr. Herbst and Dr. Reel referenced. Thank you guys very much, and hope everyone has a good rest of your day.